Hello, listeners. My name is Jackson Meisner,
And I'm Mohammed Kazarounian.
and welcome back to A Winter of Discontent. Today, we'll be talking about the national conservative grievances behind the current national populist revolt that we're seeing across the Western world. We're going to begin with the national conservative narrative of the post-war liberal order's ascendancy and its ideological hegemony. Then we're going to turn later in the episode to the ideological and spiritual grievances that national conservatives have against the liberal order. And then we're going to talk about the liberal responses to those critiques, and then end with a discussion of where the two of us weigh in on this debate. So just starting out, because I think this is an important thing to kind of get clear right off the bat, we're going to start off with what the actual national conservative narrative of liberal hegemony is, or why they think it's bad. National conservatives are going to say generally that they think that the point of sort of living, or the point of being alive, is to live the good life, not a good life, the good life, which is, we've discussed this in earlier episodes, but it's made up of multiple very sort of specific things or belong to specific institutions. And their problem with liberalism is that liberalism is destroying the good life by not valuing those institutions like religion, country, or family, and that these are exactly the things that national conservatism wants to preserve. So there's this narrative essentially that really ever since the French Revolution, there's been this push by liberalism to get rid of tradition, to devalue religion, to give individuals more autonomy, even if it makes them more lonely or makes them not good citizens. And that essentially in the modern era, these concerns have reached a fever point, and that now it's time, in their eyes, for national conservatives to really fight back against this trend.
Yeah. And speaking of modern times, for, most political scientists and historians, we can, they would understand the modern sort of like liberal international order, or at least the Western sort of liberal ascendancy, having emerged at the end of World War II, with the defeat of fascism and, most of the Western world's, unity in the face of, socialism or communism emanating from the Soviet Union. And so this post-war liberal order ends up becoming relatively like hegemonic, right? Most political parties and most institutions and most of our society understand that, we can't go back to the interwar period where we try to enforce the good life ideologies like communism, socialism, or fascism. And most people, accept like, progressive liberal changes throughout society as, Western societies become more egalitarian and less hierarchical. And so for national conservatives, this amounts to the, full, attack on the good life and their form of society that they want. This liberal hegemony, or this post-war liberal order, is the problem. And so I think I can start with one of the major, texts that's been floating around that critiques the liberal order and what's wrong with it from a sort of national conservative sort of, background. It's called Return of the Strong Gods, Nationalism, Populism, and the Future of the West by R.R. Reno. So Reno argues that in the post-war era, a liberal paradigm was formed that pushed for greater openness, tolerance, diversity, and individualism. And he calls these things the weak gods. And as opposed to what they were pushing against, they pushed against the strong gods of what he like nationalism, religion, and culture. Strong gods, as he defines them, are, quote, the objects of men's love and devotion, the sources of the passions and loyalties that unite societies. So these are sort of like good life, basically, concepts or higher values, as opposed to, the weak gods of like openness and like maybe individualism that don't promote, high, objective morality, good life values, and rather just, push for pluralism. He says that, the weak gods pushed out the strong gods in the post-war order because the strong gods were blamed for causing much of the chaos, war, and destruction of the first half of the 20th century, World War II, World War I, interwar chaos. But Reno says the strong gods are necessary because they give us social belonging and rescue us from an alienating and atomizing individualism. He says they give us love and meaning in the world, and without it, Western societies have been degrading from the inside. The masses yearn for meaning, social solidarity, and attachment. This is the force behind the current national populist revolt that we're seeing throughout the Western world, a desire for nationalism, identity, and belonging.
Yeah, Reno's argument is very interesting here, and it's definitely something that you see other national conservatives repeating in one form or another. Essentially, the vision is that the good life, it had certain, it was good, of course, and in their mind, the ideal that people should push for. But of course, the strong gods that backed it could be taken to extremes, as was seen during the Second World War with genocide, mass global conflict. But he sort of says that this was getting rid of the strong gods at the end of World War II was almost like throwing the baby out with the bathwater in a little bit. Suddenly the good life was de-emphasized by liberals in favor of this sort of empty liberal political vision that just doesn't provide any guidance for living any sort of good life. They believe that therefore, just because the strong gods led to some bad things, that therefore we should have no strong gods and we should have no way to achieve sort of meaning or attachment, or that if you do care about those things, then that's just something the individual has to decide for themselves, and society can't guide anyone towards anything like that. National conservatism, in the form of sort of the ongoing national populist revolt that we see today, is instead trying to bring back those strong gods and to bring back the good life vision of politics, where loyalties and attachments to higher ideals are given more importance than whatever the individual feels at any given moment, and even more important than just the idea that there should be pluralism or that there should be openness. After all, if there is one good life, then anything that isn't that good life is necessarily a bad life or a less good life, and it kind of naturally flows through those should be de-emphasized in favor of the good life.
Yeah, and this sort of like what we've seen, with the liberal hegemony today, at least since World War II, and that de-emphasizing of the good life, we can, if you want to just see just how strong, the liberal hegemony is, and just how much, the Western world has gone in a sort of liberal direction away from the strong gods or the good life, we can look at conservatives, right, who we would expect to be, pretty opposed to liberal ideas. But in actuality and reality, in the post-war period, conservatives have definitely agreed upon a wide variety of liberal values and public policy options and things like that. And in that sense, you could say like maybe conservatives are quote unquote captured by liberal hegemony. Not saying that, that they are been like were sold out or anything like that. But because liberalism has been such a hegemonic idea, conservatives have to go along or tend to agree with many liberal values. I mean, for instance, generally speaking, until the rise of Trump, Republicans in the United States were in favor of at least some moderate form of legal immigration. Most conservatives around the Western world were fine with greater multilateralism and multinational institutions that binded the world together, like World Bank and like IMF and things like that. They were in favor of joining supranational organizations like the EU, like conservatives in Western Europe certainly were. And conservatives, generally speaking, while they oppose the like progressive, changes since the 1960s, in social life, they didn't resort to authoritarian or dictatorial measures to roll them back like they did in the interwar period throughout much of the Western or European world. So we can kind of see that conservatives have tacitly accepted a lot of like liberal values and positions. I don't know if Jackson, you want to add on to that, because I probably missed a few examples. But
yeah, I mean, there's NatCons will sort of like jeeringly say towards more moderate conservatives that they just simply represent the right flank of liberalism, or that all they're doing is basically acting as a weight on the back end of liberalism, making it move forward slower, but move forward nonetheless. And that what's different with NatCons is that they're going to stop them from moving forward at all, or maybe even drag them back. And I think that, Mohammed, you've done a very good like summary of a lot of just the NatCon, or a lot of like how NatCons are frustrated with how they see conservatives, or how they think mainstream conservatives basically sold out.
yeah.
And they point out all these grievances they have towards like liberal society in general, and a lot of them are these sort of like, as we've kind of alluded to so far, these ideological and spiritual grievances. There's this critique that, you know, back in the day, you grow up in one town, you probably live in that town your entire life. Maybe you move somewhere else, but it's probably pretty close by, at least within the same state, most likely. You develop attachments to where you live. Multiple generations of your family are living in one place. You know, you're supporting each other, you develop ties to the community, and just a basic love sort of for the land that you live in a very local sense. What national conservatives accuse liberals of doing is destroying that. They basically say liberalism, and really more modernity in general, promotes transience, essentially. It's very open in regards to people's personal decisions. It's kind of basically, it's really the expectation, frankly, for most like middle and upper middle class families in the United States, that their kids are going to go to college and probably move to somewhere that wasn't the place where they were born or where they grew up. That's kind of like the default assumption for a lot of people like above a certain like income demographic. And national conservatives point out this is actually very aberrant compared to most of human history, how most people have behaved. And they say this creates a type of person who therefore never really has ties to a community. The only thing they really care for essentially is their own personal pleasure, or, you know, financial gain, which, you know, then funds their own personal pleasure. And so therefore that person can't be expected to be a good citizen, in the sense that they have no loyalty to anyone other than themselves, or to their own very narrow understanding of their own well-being. And naturally, this leads to decline of citizenship, a decline of community and solidarity, conformity to sort of values that state that like openness is good, or that the only thing that matters is like financial gain. And it leads to sort of a collapse of the shared communal values that made civic life possible, or made really, in their minds, like democracy possible in the United States. Now we have a nation of people who don't see themselves as citizens, but merely as consumers or entrepreneurs. And they say you can't have a country function if that's how its people sees themselves.
Right. I mean, without, and in addition to that, without a sort of like overarching sort of understanding of common belonging, like we all belong in this nation together, we are all Christians, or we are all, you know, pro-family and pro-conservative values. We have the same understanding of the good life. Without that, national conservatives basically argue that we're becoming like atomized individuals. We're on our own. We choose our own values. We don't participate in those institutions that the good life provides for us, like the nation and the maybe church or things like that. And this leads to that decline of community, solidarity, and shared identity. And maybe, you know, going to immigration, you know, now there are other people who are not, you know, my people are in the country, and that creates, you know, a sort of division between us, and a feeling that, oh, now I just feel like I'm not part of a homogenous nation. It's just a bunch of people thrown together who just happen to live in the same land. So those are like the national conservative views on like why open modernity, or why this like liberal modernity is problematic. And maybe I think from there we can go to the liberal responses to this. You know, let's give liberals, you know, a chance to respond to these criticisms.
I think these are pretty heavy critiques, and I think it's only fair that we, you know, explore both sides of this issue, frankly, because there are responses that can be given
Hmm.
to this.
Right.
I mean, I think generally speaking, there are some liberals who would agree to some of this to a certain extent, or at least would agree that some of the problems that Nat Cons point out are real, but they would sort of say in their opinion that the sort of good of liberalism outweighs the bad. Okay, sure, we don't have maybe as much of a shared culture as we used to. People are, free to do what they want, and that means that people are going to do a lot of different things, some of which you don't like or that you don't agree with. But they'll say, but if you think that you can get a shared culture without a certain degree of violence or coercion, well, then like I have a bridge to sell you somewhere. Like they say, look at human history. These sort
Yeah.
of shared cultures that like you're fetishizing, they would say, have always come with a degree of coercion for those who don't belong. And there always have been those who don't belong, and they're usually just at best quietly shoved under the rug, and at worst they have really bad things done to them. So they say
Mhm.
natcons are either deliberately obfuscating that fact or or just choosing to not think about it.
Right. Like there's this idea that like, yeah, maybe national conservatives, they're right, that their liberalism inherently means, there's less guidance, and therefore maybe that leads to a more lonely life. But, liberal modernity today is far superior to any of the natcon or even good life examples of alternative societies with, I don't know, mass poverty or lack of freedom. There's no freedom of religion, no freedom of speech, none of these things. And I think maybe this goes into the next sort of liberal response, which is like liberalism is, despite its flaws, is like superior to alternative, like good life ideologies. And they would say, like, let's look at the historical record. I mean, the NatCon, or at least the good life ideologies, caused maybe like World War I and World War II. I mean, fascism and communism were radical ideologies that tried to transform the world, and they led to massive, amounts of corpses, right? While liberal societies have generally been peaceful, and well, they would say, the United States and other liberal societies after World War II ushered in the most peaceful and prosperous period in human history, right? So which one is it? Do you want to do like fascism, communism, or whatever medieval or feudal societies before the Industrial Revolution were doing, where people lived to like 35, and if you didn't agree with the king that his standard or flag is the best flag in the world, you get like your head chopped off? Or would you rather deal with a maybe slightly boring or aimless modernity, but one that's far safer, far wealthier, and far more free than that? So
Yeah, I think
yeah.
Well, I think the last argument that I think we're going to sort of give as as the response that liberals would give comes from many people, but Francis Fukuyama, who is a sort of very prominent contemporary liberal thinker, really advances this argument as one of his main arguments in favor of liberalism. He says, like, okay, if we're going to talk about strong gods, these sort of like, institutions or beliefs that both give meaning and in turn demand loyalty, he would say those are inferior to pluralism or the idea that everyone just gets to choose what they want to do. He points out, like, naturally, yeah, like for most of human history, like if you happen to disagree with what the strong gods were, you would just get murdered. And essentially there was no way
Yeah.
to resolve conflicts within society that
Hmm.
didn't result in somebody getting killed, because there weren't essentially any outlets for that to be, for like questions of morality to be peacefully discussed and sort of peacefully come to terms with. He's like, for most of the sort of strong gods history of humanity, you either were killed by authority for disagreeing, or you had enough power to where you could become the authority and bring in your strong gods to destroy the enemy's strong gods. He says liberal democracy is really remarkable, frankly, in the sense
Hmm.
that it's the first like institution or like sort of political technology within world history that allows there to be pretty radical people, pretty radical different views to coexist within the same society without killing each other. And he would say that's
Yeah.
really like something we take for granted now, and we don't understand how aberrant that is for most of human history, where, if you disagreed, you either fought or you died to resolve that disagreement by the sword. Now we can resolve it over, like, I don't know, Twitter or something, or through elections. And he says it's really irresponsible, frankly, for national conservatives to throw away that legacy, considering how precarious it is and how unnatural to human society it is. We should be really glad by what we have created as a liberal society, where we can even begin to think that like boredom is the worst of our problems.
Right. I mean, and just adding on to Fukuyama's critique, I think he's writing in Liberalism and Its Discontents. I might be wrong, but I think that's where he outlines a lot of these arguments. He says, like, look, the idea that, value pluralism or this sort of pluralist sort of ideology, that underlies liberalism arose because of the conflicts in early modern Europe. I think he especially points to England, which had religious differences between like Protestants and Catholics and various denominations of the Christians there. And he says that because of these, interminable disagreements over religion, which led to many wars and strife and conflict, liberalism sort of arose as a way. It's like, hey, well, maybe we disagree, but we don't need to enforce these religions on everyone else, right? To each their own, basically, right? Live and let live. And Fukuyama argues that that sort of agreement to adhere to like this liberal pluralism effectively solved those sectarian conflicts in like the 17th and 18th centuries and gave rise to like the modern sort of like freedom of religion. And he this is like just one example, but this is, I think, where he like really focuses on where that pluralism came from. I think maybe I wanted to add, Jackson, the one last like liberal response that a lot of liberals will give, and they'll say like, you know what, those strong gods, right, like religion and nationalism, for instance, maybe you care about them and maybe you think they're real and very important, but maybe to some extent those are either untrue or they're backward, right? Maybe like some liberals would say, they're not necessarily religious, and they would say, well, you know what? I mean, I don't believe in your God, right? Why should I care, right? Or like, I don't want to adhere to a backwards idea of like tribalism, like through like nationalism, right? Like that's not something of the modern world. That's from back in the day, right? Not saying all liberals believe that, but a fair number do think that way. Right. So from their perspective, why are we holding on to a bunch of like backwards or, quite frankly, ignorant superstitions?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point to add. I think now we can move on to our sort of discussion, like, because we've talked about what NatCons think about liberalism, what liberals think about NatCons' thoughts about liberalism. So now we'll do what we think about NatCons and liberals' thoughts about liberalism, if you can keep all that straight. But just our thoughts on the grievances in general. I mean, I'll just go first, but I think that, and again, before we started this podcast, me and Mohammed have had this discussion between the two of us many times. And one point that I've always come back to is I can understand from the NatCon perspective, and it can even sympathize to a certain extent with their problems with liberalism. Like there definitely does seem to be a sort of atomization problem within our society, especially these days. And it doesn't seem like there's all that much that hold people together in common anymore. Like, I mean, just in general, like, Mohammed, can you think of like the last, and I'm even talking about this in like a pop cultural sense, can you think of the last like major event that everybody in the country saw and knew and like talked about? Like, it doesn't even feel like we have a mass culture anymore.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, I remember summer 2023, Barbenheimer. Maybe Stranger Things is a good example of this. Maybe like
Yeah.
it kind of was like a big cultural phenomenon, but then kind of petered off. I don't
Game
know.
of Thrones was like the last show that everybody watched, and like you could just go to you go to like rural Texas versus like Metro New York, and someone would have an opinion how bad the final season of the show was. But like I do think that like that's a small kind of like micro level, like microcosm of what we're talking about. But I do think it is like, unfortunately, if you do say that everyone's allowed to do what they want or believe whatever they want, then eventually things are going to trend in a direction where there's a lot of just like society becomes very subcultural or perhaps very sort of like tribal or almost like self-segregated, where you just have small groups of people with similar beliefs kind of operating on their own within a system where they're forced to interact with other groups, but where they don't actually have to share any common beliefs with them.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would share your view there, Jackson. I do think the National Conservatives have a point when they say that liberalism is a force that kind of erodes good life or the strong gods like religion or tradition or nationalism. I think there is an inherent, ideological tension there because, liberalism at its core is about individualism, right? It's saying that each person can choose what they would like to do, right? They can choose what values they want to do. And if they don't want to do this, support the strong gods or, the good life vision, that's their prerogative. And I think what we've seen today is either, it's difficult to sustain these things, right? When you have the choice, well, it turns out it's kind of hard to participate in civic life. It's kind of hard to participate in community. It's kind of hard to uphold, I don't know, national values or things like that. And I think because of that, well, if you're given the choice, well, maybe you're just going to decide it's not worth my time. I'll just focus on my own life. And I think this is where I think the grievances are kind of accurate. I do think liberals have put a lot of faith in individuals and their penchant, supposedly to make good decisions. And I think, well, maybe NatCons are right that people aren't going to choose like good life things. Like I think they have a point there.
Yeah, or they might not even choose things like, even if you don't agree with with NatCons that there is the idea of a good life, they just might not choose things that are good for the country in general. Like this is one criticism that a lot of generally philosophers have made, but it's sort of like an understanding of like what freedom is. And a lot of more conservative or like NatCon related, like political thinkers would say liberalism, it claims that it's giving you freedom, but what's it giving you the freedom to do? What, like become addicted to drugs, addicted to pornography, addicted to all the small pleasures in life, where there's no institution telling you to stop, no institution imposing order or discipline on your life. You say that you're free, but in reality, basically what liberalism just turns you into is like a bundle of nerves and like they're just directing your everyday action, and you're just seeking, to give yourself more and more and more pleasure. You're not really thinking about what it means. You're not thinking of if it's good for anyone. They would say that's really more the behavior of an addict than it is the behavior of a free individual. And at least our system might seem harsh, but it gives the individual sort of higher, rational mind the ability to control its actions, or it subordinates you to a system that encourages you to live better. In some ways, I think that this can easily become an argument in favor of just like coercion, because who gets to decide what is better? I think that is a very live question, and it's one that I think NatCons never really, I think, satisfactorily, at least in my opinion, grapple with. But I do think they have something when they say that the liberal idea of freedom often does seem very unsatisfying. I think for freedom to mean something, it does require a level of self-discipline, and liberalism doesn't create the conditions for you to develop self-discipline in the first place.
Yeah, I do think there is something to be said about what is real freedom. I mean, if you are free, but that just means you're free to indulge or become a slave to your maybe natural impulses, right? Like, I mean, look at us with screens, like our relationship with modern technology. I mean, I think we are all, in a way, we're slaves of our like screens and our modern technology around us. I mean, can we really go without social media or I don't know, watching, movies or YouTube or whatever it is, right? Like, I don't know. Like, I think that's where NatCons have a point. Like, real freedom would be being, freedom from our natural urges and, the freedom to have that discipline, right? So, I mean, this is where I am sympathetic with them. That I don't believe that we can just force virtue on people, just force that self-control or discipline on people. I don't think that's going to work, but there is something to be said about what they're saying. And then maybe, Jackson, we should move on to the next topic I want to discuss, but like the merits of the post-war liberal order.
Yeah, I think the post-war order, it's funny to compare it now to today, because I do think there's some pretty big differences. And I think this is one thing where some NatCons have brought this up as one reason why things seemed to be things at least seemed more socially stable and put together during the like post-war sort of Cold War era versus today. And they would say it's because there actually was like a geopolitical like ideological competition during the Cold War, where like there actually was a unifying American value even after the 1960s, and that value was anti-communism.
Right.
even people on the left, unless you were on the extreme left in the United States, you were not in favor of communism, and you would probably go to some lengths to sort of display your anti-communist credentials. You'd say anti-communism was a bipartisan and like almost universally agreed upon foreign policy position for both parties, and it's why the U.S. was able to have such a coherent foreign policy for so long,
Mhm.
especially in comparison to today, where there isn't such a united value. And so, sort of this, without this external enemy for everybody to put aside their differences to unite against, suddenly society seems a lot more atomized, or sort of a lot more divided. Whereas you would say there were divisions during the Cold War, pretty serious ones, but you could paper them over at least by
Yeah.
saying, well, at least we're not communists.
Right. I think adding on to there's two things that come to mind on this question. I think one on the merit, just the pure merits, post-war liberal order, 1945 to today. I think undoubtedly it was in many ways, a great success, right? I mean, for the first time, Western European countries are not at each other's throats, right? Because of NATO and because of, the alliances between friendship between, France, Germany, US, UK, Italy, etc. That's a massive accomplishment considering, I don't know, the last 1,000 years of like European history. So that's a big accomplishment. The liberal sort of Western order like succeeded against its rivals, right? The Cold War was successful. The NATO and the Western liberal powers defeated communism, or at least communism collapsed, right? And they managed to stop the cycle of violence and chaos that had erupted in Europe since 1914 and the beginning of World War I. Not to mention that the post-war era was a period of, especially in the first 3 decades, a period of great prosperity and economic growth and the expansion of, maybe things like the welfare state and creating, maybe for the first time, mass societies where most people were well off and most people could thrive. And I think those are all great things. I would say that the thing I would like to suggest, though, and this is my second point, is I think the post-war liberal order is not as liberal as people say. And I think Jackson kind of mentioned this to some extent. I mean, the post-war order, at least until the fall of the Soviet Union, was marked by a sort of like titanic like clash between liberalism and socialism or communism. That's not really like a liberal thing. It's more like a tribalist sort of us versus them sort of thing. And then in the first few decades of post-war order, I mean, at least until like the late 60s or even 70s, depending on where you are in the West, these societies are pretty conservative. Like there's, women are still not, legal equals of men in the workplace and in many areas of society. These places are generally pretty conformist societies. Most people are also very participating still in religious institutions and in community activities or in unions or other civil society organizations. There's relatively high turnout and interest in elections. So I would say these societies are pretty conservative. For good or ill, they're not as liberal, at least maybe not like the 70s, 80s, or 90s, as some people would say they were.
Yeah, I just one like quick example of this. I'm just looking at Gallup polls right now. In the early 90s, in like 1991, I'm pretty sure opinion of interracial marriage between white and black people. This is 1991, by the way, was only 48% of Americans approved of it. It doesn't necessarily mean that 52% disapproved. It could be that there were more who just didn't have an opinion or were neutral on it. But something that, like, right now, at least as of 2021, the approval rating is 94%. So that shows that even like back then, we really kind of underestimate how, I guess, progressive generally society has become. And
Yeah.
so, we think of the 60s as this turning point, and sure, it kind of was in a broad multi-decade perspective, but at the time it wouldn't have really seemed that anything was all that different, especially if you didn't live in a city where there were a lot of hippies, or if you weren't in a university town. It would have seemed more or less that things were kind of continuing as they had before.
Right. Maybe these liberal societies organically like kind of adopted good life, or at least like their vision of society, like almost more naturally or without coercion, and not from like the state. But I think that kind of marked the post-war order. So maybe conservative without forced, we force you to become conservative or traditional. Except I guess there's some obvious counterexamples like segregation and things like that. But I think here we should now weigh in on those liberal responses we gave earlier to the NatCon grievances and what we think. I don't know, maybe Jackson, you want to start off there?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, it's kind of a similar like thing to what we said with the NatCons, where we think, like with the NatCons, we thought that there were some merits to the critique, but it went too far or was obfuscating certain points, or just was missing certain things. I think we kind of feel a similar way with the liberal responses. We've agreed with a lot of the NatCon critiques of liberalism, but we do think that generally speaking, the good in liberalism has outweighed the bad. Regarding like these sort of positions that because Mama sort of mentions this as one opinion, that like something that liberals will do where they'll just sort of like outright reject conservative positions as being sort of just the products of like backwardness and ignorance. I do think that while I understand where this notion comes from, I do think it's a bit of a mistake and maybe not necessarily fair of them to do so. Like, I think one thing that does make a lot of people, not just necessarily conservatives, but a lot of people in the United States very upset is the sort of feeling, especially the feeling around sort of like 2020 and 2021, that you're kind of forced to agree with like liberal hardline social positions on a lot of issues. This sort of like, I guess, like what people would call like the peak woke era. I think that there is sort of an attitude within liberalism that presumes its own positions to be sort of correct and its own positions to be self-evident. And I think sometimes it forgets to make room for other, positions or other people who don't necessarily agree with them. And I know some people will say, okay, well, why should I like agree with a position that like preaches intolerance or something like that? But this is sort of one thing that you have to bite the bullet on if you really do believe in like a liberal pluralist society, which is that, if you say you believe in pluralism, you have to prove it. You actually have to, have pluralism on questions, even when you do feel that there's one right answer, or else if you don't, then you kind of are accepting the premise of the National Conservatives that there is a good life, or that there is sort of one way to do things, and that it's appropriate to use government force or social force or some sort of coercion to force people into that view. Unfortunately, like if you actually do believe that pluralism is a good thing, you have to accept that people are going to have some beliefs that you think are morally heinous. And it's a tough thing for people to hear, but I think if you're a liberal and you value liberalism, you have to accept it to some level, or else you're probably not actually a liberal.
Right. I think you have a good point there. I think liberals' hegemony or sort of ascendancy or definitely it's feeling that it's kind of won the battle. The ideological battles led it to think like I'm maybe going to disregard these critiques, these like maybe conservative critiques. And I do think there is something to be said about, well, then liberals have to adhere by their own standards. I think they would respond with, what about the tolerance paradox, right? Like we can't be tolerant of, intolerant beliefs. And I think there's merit there too. But I think then we get into like, okay, but what is an intolerant belief? Like I think like, saying, being like evangelical Christian isn't like necessarily an intolerant belief. Like I don't think that like the Republican Party, for instance, at least as of this time, is going to be like enforcing like a theocratic state on the United States.
Give it a few years.
Sorry, what?
Give it a few years.
Right. Maybe in a few years from now, when, as I said in the last episode, the Republicans arrested Democrats, but we're not there yet. So I think that, yeah, there's, some wiggle room here, but I think there is a tolerance paradox to keep in mind, but I think for the most part, conservatives have actually stayed within liberal norms until at least very recently. There have been some hiccups there, but generally speaking, I think the track record since World War II has been pretty good. And I think maybe turning to our thoughts on other liberal responses, I think that with the whole like liberalism is superior, created like superior societies that are better off. Like I think this is a pretty strong argument. Like liberal societies I think if you just ask someone on the street, would you rather live in like Soviet Union or Nazi Germany or maybe like a, I don't know, medieval like European feudal sort of thing, or you could live in now? I think a lot of people will be like, well, now kind of, maybe not everything's going great, but I think most people, when they really think about it, like they would go with now. And I
Yeah.
think this is where, yeah,
If I found someone who said I'd rather live in Nazi Germany, I'd have some questions.
I would have many questions
I
for
might I
them.
might just run away.
Right. I think this is where it's yeah, liberalism has a very strong argument here. I don't think that totally absolves liberalism, and I think many of the successes of liberal societies are in part because it allows people to authentically pursue, the good life in a way that, authoritarian, knack or like, good life societies maybe corrupted their, their ideology, like maybe forcing religion on people, for instance, I think has to some degree corrupted the societies that did that. While in liberal societies, ironically, with allowing freedom of religion, allowed, the practice of these religions in a more authentic and maybe truthful way. So maybe it's the success of liberalism is maybe a little has some asterisks attached to it. I don't know. Maybe Jackson, you could talk about that, but I was wondering if you could talk about like the Fukuyama argument because that's another like big one. Um,
Yeah, this is one thing where at least for me personally, I do think Fukuyama's like right on the money with this. Again, it's like growing up in the United States, we kind of do accept as a premise that people are allowed to say whatever we want, or it's like the kind of thing of a guy will throw up his hands back. Well, it's a free country, like I can do whatever I want. It's like that's such a ingrained American notion that we don't understand that for most of human history, saying that like out loud publicly would have been considered like at best a mark of like insanity and or at worst a
right.
mark for you to go to prison basically. And like we really like I think undervalue, especially recently, the sort of success that liberalism has had in creating a society based around rule of law and around pluralism. Like this is going off of kind of partially the like liberals saying the traditional things are bad and ignorant, but also related to the pluralism argument. Just if you look at the debate surrounding like gay marriage, for example, this is interesting because gay marriage was never legal in the United States for the vast majority of its history. For the vast majority of its history, it was considered like completely aberrant, criminal. Actually, I think in most of the country, being gay was actively a crime. It was called sodomy. But like the idea that the liberal system was able to take this thing which had been previously considered completely out of the norm and through dialogue, through pluralism, through conversation, and through contesting it in public, we were able to sort of peacefully make it legal and get
Mhm.
it to a point now where even I think I'd have to get fact checked on this. I believe even now either a small majority or at least a plurality of Republicans think that gay marriage should continue to remain legal. And that's actually gone down in the last few years. I think the number was around like 60% of Republicans at its height. So the fact that that extremely contentious question, a question of what does marriage mean, what's the proper sexual ethic for a society, the fact that that fraud of a question was able to be resolved peacefully at the ballot box and through millions of conversations between people of different opinions, and the fact that we could come to an agreement on that, I think really shows the power of
Mm.
liberalism. For most of human history, that question either wouldn't have been asked because the ruling society would not have allowed it to be asked, or it would have been the result of some regime change due to a war, essentially, that killed like millions
Yeah.
or hundreds of thousands of people. And so I think we really, really are operating on like dangerous footing when we begin to say that pluralism is out of date, or that we need to reject it, or that we can't let it, or we need to narrow it. I understand when national conservatives say that there are problems, with a lack of solidarity between peoples. And I think there are ways of addressing that that don't involve sort of regressing back to a medieval or to a 20th century totalitarian model of
Yeah.
social organization.
I mean, yeah, I mean, going off what you're saying, I think looking at history, especially, I think pluralism has maybe it's not solved all the problems in the world, but it's definitely been a useful and sometimes highly useful sort of tool that has managed to resolve conflicts. I'm just going back to like Europe. I mean, a lot of the religious conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, I don't think would have been solved without this idea of pluralism. And look at our own country, right? If like our country is very diverse, right? Like we have many different races and religious opinions and political opinions, like and ethnic groups. I don't know, how would you enforce like, like a whites only America, maybe like the radical national conservatives want, or how would you enforce like a, Christian nationalist thing? Like imagine if you tried to do that and the violence and chaos that would arise from that, right? And because of the pluralism in the American system, being a, liberal constitutionalist system, we are, free of those conflicts. And unfortunately, many people around the world to this day, I mean, we can see around, I mean, go around the world, we could look at maybe sectarian conflicts over the decades, and then maybe in the Middle East, for example, or even the like authoritarian regimes in China and Russia, which crack down on minorities. Maybe we should be thankful for the sort of pluralism that we have today.
Yeah, or to just look where people are going. I don't see a mass exodus of people fleeing the United States and moving to Russia or China. I
Right.
mean, like, people vote with their feet. They did it during the Cold War, and they're still doing it today, even with the problems that the West is facing. It's not to deny that there are problems. It's not to deny that there are problems with liberalism, even. But I think NatCons vastly overstate the sort of attractiveness of their own solutions. They might be good at diagnosing problems. When it comes time to offer
Yeah.
anything prescriptive, you just really start falling off the rails or just going into pure flights of fancy.
Yeah. And with that, I think we should conclude this episode here. So this has been our episode on the ideological grievances that NatCons have. But if you join us next time, we'll be talking about the material grievances that national conservatives have, the material grievances behind the National Populist Revolt. This has been Mohammed Kazarunian.
And this is Jackson Meisner.
And we're signing off for a winter of discontent. Thank you and hope to catch you next time.